All right. Well, welcome to the Fuse podcast where we spark change through conversation. My name is Max Nelson.
I'm Yatin Sharma.
And today we're going to be talking to Dr. William Sandel. Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we jump into what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Bill Sandel. I'm a criminology professor here at Missouri State University, and I also direct our graduate certificate in crime prevention. My research and primary service focus is on active shooter events and responding to such events, helping law enforcement better respond to those events and be able to stop the killing and stop the dying.
Right. And that kind of leads me to like the next question, specifically focusing on active shooter events. Is there like a legal penalty for active shootings that's different for mass shootings?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing because even though we have these federal definitions, oftentimes when we talk about charging these people for crimes, they're being charged for murder, right? It's not that you are charged with an active shooter event. An active shooter event, while of course the action is a crime, the actual crime is murder
Yeah.
or attempted murder,
yeah,
right?
Makes
So
sense.
there's nobody who goes into a courtroom and is being charged for an active shooter event or charged for mass
Yeah.
murder specifically. They're being charged for multiple
Yeah.
murders.
So for like active shooter event, the person didn't hit anybody. Nobody's even injured. Is that a charge of like attempted first degree? Because an active shooter event, you would typically plan this stuff out.
They can be planned.
Mhm.
There are cases where somebody was fired, went out, got a gun out of their car, came back in and shot everybody they could in the workplace, right? There are some people that plan for years and have manifestos, and it's very different.
Yeah.
As far as the charging, that's completely up to the prosecuting office and what they determine, right? The police don't
Right.
really have a say in that. They're just gathering evidence after responding to these events and trying to build a case, but it's totally up to the prosecutor on deciding what to actually charge.
If you talk about how much percentage of people go for manifesting this, and how much percent of people go for like heat of the moment, do you have that?
I mean,
Something on that?
It's very difficult to say because that data is typically tried to it's collected after the fact, and we try to make assumptions or conclusions based on sometimes an active shooter that may have been committed suicide on scene or killed as a result of the active shooting. So it's very difficult to really put numbers on that. Certainly, anecdotally, we do see cases in both fields, but I couldn't tell you exactly. It's nothing we've ever collected.
I could not fathom like just being in that. Like, what kind of a mental place do you have to be in to like get fired or something like that, and then go like that is an insane place to be at.
Yeah, we certainly as a society always want to say somebody had to be crazy to be able to do that, right?
It
We
feels like it.
can't, yeah, we can't imagine us doing something like that. So we would say nobody in their right mind would just go in and start killing everybody they saw or trying to kill everybody they saw, right? But many of these shooters, like I said, especially in the beginning half of the data, were dead by the end of these events. So it's really hard psychologically to go back and try to analyze them. Certainly people do that, and we see attempts at that all the time, but it's kind of poor psychology to try to just make definitive statements about a person's state of mind if they're no longer there to actually be analyzed, right? And so that's what's difficult about making these determinations about the people who do these shootings. Certainly they're in a different place than the three of us would be in response to a similar event.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's hard to say that 100% every single one of them was out of their mind crazy, right? And that's
Right.
difficult. It's difficult that we can't say that. But I will say one interesting thing is I think we're starting to get better data on that because in more recent years, less shooters are committing suicide or being shot by police as a response to this. So a lot more being subdued. And we can start to actually analyze these attackers and really see kind of the motive behind them.
Yeah. I'm from St. Louis, and recently there was an active shooter event, and I believe a school shooting that happened in St. Louis. But the person I believe was killed at the scene. Is there an increased expectation for police officers to fire first, ask questions later, or subdue? Is there like a new policy, or is it more state to state?
So there's no real policy in place for that, but you do have to think And this is what's so different about an active shooter event. This is somebody actively trying to kill as many people as they can, often. And we know that police officers certainly have the ability to use deadly force in situations where people are trying to kill them or trying to kill other citizens. And that's what these cases are. People are trying to kill as many people as possible or shoot at the police officers when they get there. It's definitely one of the most dangerous responses police officers can go to. So frequently, there is no question on whether the use of force was correct or not. I can't think of any off the top of my head. There may have been out there, but I mean, frequently these are clearly ongoing killings where police will give commands and then get shot at, or the shooter commits suicide as soon as police arrive, that sort of thing.
So, how do media coverage and public discourse around mass shooting or active shooters impact the frequency and the severity of these events?
It's really difficult to say. We kind of prescribe to this "don't name them" campaign to try to help with any sort of contagion effect that seeing an active attack or an active shooting might have in the media. And so, and by we, I mean the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Center, the Alert Center, who's the FBI's national standard for active shooter training and response. So these guys were named the gold standard of how to respond to active shooter events. And that's where I worked before I came up here to Missouri State University. And they really push this idea of don't name them, don't talk about the shooter, don't give that person their 15 minutes of fame, but instead focus on the victims and their lives and what they contributed to the world. And that is frequently to try to get to where people aren't getting that spotlight. So there is no real contagion effect where somebody says, well, they talked about that person for weeks on the media, so now I'm going to, because I want to be talked about, right? Though I'm sure that does happen. I have no specific numbers on it, though. It's a very difficult thing because, like I said, for a lot of these cases, the shooter is dead by the end of it. So there's no real, did you do this because you saw it on a news report and wanted to emulate it, or how that worked?
Go ahead and talk about the was it the active shooter center or the alert center? Yeah, the alert center. Go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
They started actually back in 2002 as a response to Columbine, which is kind of seen as the keystone event for modern active shooter events. While there were active shooter events prior to 1999 when Columbine happened, it was kind of a jumping off point for police responding to these events, because in Columbine, what you had was officers who were generally trained to show up to a scene like that, set a perimeter because active shooting was not very common, and wait for SWAT to get there and be able to deal with this.
It still happens a lot.
And I mean, when it takes a long time for SWAT to show up, obviously people are dying this entire time, because what that sort of policy is geared towards is more of a hostage or barricaded suspect, right? But when people are just dying this whole time, we have to be able to respond to these faster. So the Alert Center was born, and they actually worked with the FBI on creating these courses that they can offer to police officers in how to respond to these actual events, to try to, like I said, stop the killing and stop the dying as fast as possible.
Can you talk about that a little bit, or is it like a bit confidential? Like you got to go to the
so
center
the actual courses they offer are for law enforcement or first responder only, because there is a movement towards this rescue task force model, which includes fire and EMS as part of the response process as well. But they do offer what's called a CRACE course, or a civilian response to active shooter events course. And it once again uses data to kind of go through how you as a civilian could respond to this. And I'm sure you guys have heard Run, Hide, Fight before.
Oh yeah.
Right? That was kind of made in conjunction with Houston PD and the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
And then Alert kind of came along and did more of a research examination of this, and came out with Avoid, Deny, Defend, or ADD. And they're fairly similar to Run, Hide, Fight, but there are some key differences.
What are those differences
that make it important? So
Because I've never heard of this before.
Yeah.
I was born in '02, so
Yeah,
I've seen every iteration, I thought, but this is brand new.
yeah, so avoid, deny, defend. When we look at avoid versus run, there's a little bit more of a tactical way of thinking when we think about avoidance, right? Running, we think pick a direction and take off, right?
And that's what I was always told was like, hey, get
Right.
out the window and bolt.
Yeah,
Like,
just
get
get away
on
as
your way
fast
out,
as
but, you know.
possible. And that makes a lot of sense unless you're in a complex area
Right.
or maybe you only are thinking about a primary exit and that's where the shooter comes through. Well, now you have nowhere to run, but if you're thinking about the idea of avoiding, you're thinking a little more tactically. Maybe there's a secondary exit. Maybe there's a way out the back. Maybe I can break a window and get through it like we saw in Virginia Tech, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit more tactical way of thinking. The biggest difference really comes between the idea of denying access to your location or hiding.
Mm-hmm.
Hiding, people typically think, okay, I'll crawl under my desk or, I'll hide behind this cabinet, that sort of thing. But to my knowledge, once an attack has begun, no active shooter has ever breached a locked door. So denying access to your location, instead of saying, I need to hide under this desk, maybe you say, I need to run to this door and lock it. You've just increased your level of survivability dramatically, right?
Because they're
Or
not
if you
trying to,
barricade.
break in anywhere. They're just wandering
It
around
takes
the
too much
halls waiting
time.
for someone to wander out.
It takes too much time.
Right.
And we also know that a lot of people who have gone the hiding route in events have been found and shot. If you're hiding under a desk, you've kind of trapped yourself. If the active shooter walks around and now you're huddled under a desk and they're standing above you, we know that active shooters tend to hunt and look for people. We've seen active shooters shoot people that already look dead and are dead. So we know that playing dead is not a great option. So it's really going to that mindset of do everything you can to stop the shooter from getting to you if you can avoid. Right? So barricade if you can't lock the door, that sort of thing. And when it comes to defend versus fight, it's more of a semantic argument. People kind of have a negative connotation with the word fight. You're told your whole life you're not supposed to fight people. Fighting is bad. But everybody knows they have a right to defend themselves.
Gotcha.
And most all of the run, hide, fight training now teaches all these tactics. It's still just under the catchier kind of run, hide, fight.
That's fair. It is a lot catchier.
ADD. Yeah, it's been around for longer. So
because that does sound familiar. Just ADD, I never heard of. B, because whenever I was sitting in the classroom, it was always like, all right, like we're gonna, we're gonna go and we're gonna immediately lock the door. We're gonna hide out of view, and then hey, all the boys and the teacher are gonna grab a weapon and get ready just in case.
Yeah, because if it comes down to you being stuck in a room with the attacker and it's do nothing and be shot, or maybe do something and not be shot. And we really see in school attacks, this is where the highest group of citizen subduing the attacker as the end result happens in schools. I want to say it's in around 36% of the active attack cases. So that includes knives and vehicles as well.
Okay. That's a big chunk.
Versus 14% in businesses and stuff like that. So it's, we have definitely seen this be effective, right? And so, and schools are certainly a little different. There's typically a pre-established relationship between the teacher and the attacker, that sort of thing. So the civilians have a little bit of an upper hand in those situations. But once again, if you're trapped in the room with the shooter, defend yourself and don't fight fair, right? This is a fight for survival.
Just kick in at that point. I mean,
bite, scratch, gouge, do whatever you can to win that fight, get that gun away, because otherwise you are likely to be shot if you're just stuck in the room with the shooter.
Street fights are not fair fights.
But that is, of course, the last, right? That is the last thing. If you are stuck, that's what you should do. If you can avoid. If you can deny access to your location, do that. But if all of that fails, then you get to the defend yourself. No active shooter class preaches going out and hunting down the attacker and trying to stop it. That's right.
Respond in kind.
That's the police officer's
Don't do that.
job.
Please don't do that. Please
And they're the ones ready to do that. But what alert's really done for police officers is, instead of having to wait for a SWAT team, if we know that this is the national standard and everyone around has had this training, you could have a patrol officer and a school resource officer and a sheriff's
Mm-hmm.
deputy and an FBI agent all show up. They've all had the same
Yeah.
training. They can form a team and go in there and immediately deal with this instead of waiting for a tactical team to show up.
Is it like you said, we practice earthquake, fire, tornado drills? Are you more likely to use your preparation during like an active shooter drill than you will like a tornado drill? Like, are we at the point in this country where it's more likely that an active shooter event is going to happen in a school than like a tornado?
It's definitely not a super common thing.
Mm-hmm.
I know oftentimes when we talk about active shooter events, we specifically think of schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to kind of exclude the 2022 numbers because that just came out a couple days ago
Fair.
in this conversation. But generally, the actually most common type of location attacked is a business.
Really?
So schools account for about 20% of active shooter events in the total data set, which is not what we think when we hear about them, right?
Yeah.
Because these are some of the most devastating. Obviously, innocent children being shot is going to get
Mm-hmm.
more coverage and more attention than somebody shooting in a McDonald's parking lot, right? But it is more common for businesses to be attacked. I do think actually the most common attack location in the 2022 data set was actually outdoors.
Really?
So starting to see more people roaming around a town or a city shooting randomly.
Wow. Oh my
But
gosh.
certainly the numbers have not capped businesses yet
Really?
in total. They did for 2022, but not in total. So it is, we think about lockdown drills and stuff for school and
Mhm.
preparing kids for that, but these are still relatively rare events when we think about how many school days there are in a year and how many schools get attacked each year.
Right.
I think the 2022 data set had 2 school attacks, and one of those was on a school bus.
Right.
So that's 2 attacks out of how many days of school
Yeah.
in how many schools in the United States, right? So still relatively infrequent, but really good to be prepared for
Yeah.
because these do happen any and everywhere.
Yeah.
This is not just an urban problem or a rural problem.
Yeah.
I mean, they truly happen everywhere.
Yeah. So outdoors, really. So what, like, we've been talking about schools this whole time in my mind. What's the difference in how law enforcement is taught to engage in a school shooting versus like, a business or somebody who's just like wandering around outside? Like, what's the difference?
So the way alert trains is not necessarily on a specific location type, but they do have classes that are more geared towards indoor responses, moving through a building, checking rooms, that sort of thing. And there is a class called the Erase class, which is specifically geared towards active shooter events out in open spaces. So it is something that police can train on and
Mhm.
should train on because
Right.
we never know how this could totally shift and outdoors could be the number one from here on out, or it could shift and schools become the number one or
Yeah.
churches become the number one. We just don't know. But what we do know is currently businesses are, like I said, in the
Yeah.
overall data set, the most common attack location.
So in those cases, I know that you said that most commonly in schools, people typically are like civilians are the ones who subdue that. So it's typically law enforcement who subdue in non-school.
So in school, 36% of the
36,
time.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So not the most, but much more
Much
than
more. Okay.
compared to the overall
How
data set.
how often do people with concealed carry, like law-abiding citizens with guns end up being the ones to subdue? Do you know that off the top of your head? If
Those
not, just
numbers are
guesstimate.
definitely in there.
Mhm.
I don't know the specific figure off the top of my head. I want to
Mhm.
say when looking at active attack, so once again, vehicles and knives
Right.
included, I want to say it's around 4%
Okay.
of the total cases.
Right.
Because I believe around 14% of the time in the overall data set, citizens are stopping the attack.
Yeah.
10% of the time they're subduing. 4% of the time they're shooting the
Right.
attacker.
Do you think then that, I mean, like, this is all just speculation, right? But everybody carried kind of thing, do you think that that might help mitigate the risk of these kinds of events happening or being less deadly than they actually are? Like, would that have any sort of an impact on the back end of it?
It's it's really hard to say, and certainly that gets
Yeah,
really political. It's hard to say whether
right.
more people would then stop the attacker or more people would then attack because they have a gun on them right then and there
Seems
when
like it'd
they're
be very
upset.
intimidating, like to be like, well, I'm gonna go, and then like all of a sudden 15 guns are pointed right back at you. It seems ideally like that would be a great thing to have,
But
right?
certainly we know that criminals don't make the wisest
They don't really
decisions,
care. They
and
don't, yeah.
yeah, it depends.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, when Alert talks about civilian response, it's
Mhm.
not whether you have a gun or whether you don't, or whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun. It's just the fact of you could consider yourself, if you were in the room with the shooter when when the shooting starts, right?
What can
You
you
can
do?
consider yourself the first responder because you are the first one there.
Yeah.
And that's why we just talk about what you do matters. It's not, you should go out and buy a gun. It's not you should take karate classes and get ready to fight all the time. It's just that what you do matters in these events.
Yeah.
And that's where the citizen role comes in. So in this conversation, we really stay away from whether people should have a gun or not. What we do say is if you do have a gun on you as a concealed carry holder, once again, it's not your job to go hunt down the attacker. It's still your job to get out of there as quickly as possible, deny access to your location, and then if you are left with no other option, defend yourself, however you see fit.
All right, we're getting into the last couple of questions here. So, can you talk for a second about how? I mean, how the hell do we get involved with the active or the alert center? Like, how can civilians get involved with that?
So the Alert Center, I think, currently has 10 classes, and 9 of those are the law enforcement specific. Citizens are not allowed in, but
Totally
they do
fair.
have that one CRACE class. And there are different ways you can request a CRACE class, or sometimes there's just some that get put on around the community. I know the Battlefield Neighborhood Watch Program, which is community wide, actually invited me to come do a CRACE class for them last month. So I did one in Battlefield. Some of the navigators at OTC recently
Right.
came over and I did a CRACE class for them. So there are people in the community that can put these classes on, or you can reach out to the Alert Center at alert.org and request to find one that's happening near you, or be able to get in touch with a point of contact who is actually certified to teach the class.
And they take donations, right?
Alert is entirely grant funded, so it
Okay.
is totally free.
Gotcha.
And in fact, that they, even for those who train citizens, they demand that you offer the training for free
Right.
because they are grant funded.
Good.
So yeah,
Good.
it's absolutely
Good.
free training, and it's not a run and gun kind of training.
Mhm.
They're not going to set blank guns off to see how you respond, which some civilian
Hey,
training
fair.
does, and
Yeah,
that's
it
that's
does.
fine. This is more of having you understand the data, getting a bigger picture of that, and then understanding what you do matters and getting more into that tactical way of thinking mindset. So if an active shooter comes through the primary location, I'm thinking about a back exit, that sort of thing.
How can we continue to have productive conversation about mass shooting or active shooters and work towards creating a safer and more peaceful place in the society?
Yeah, I think it's a very important thing to do, and I think a big part of that kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation, understanding what we're talking about. Are we talking about mass shootings? Are we talking about active shooter events? Because there's likely different responses to those sorts of things. But just continuing that conversation, educating people, I think is extremely important. Obviously, we all hope that none of us will experience these events, but it's important for us to be prepared if they do happen, right? So just thinking about your environment, keeping an eye out when you're in public, right? Kind of better understanding your surroundings. So if one of these events were to happen, you're not thinking about it on the spot while you're super stressed because there's gunshots. You already have a plan in mind. You can actually move and execute that plan. And I think that's really the important part. I think we're at this kind of education step where if we as a society can just make it more and more difficult, or these attacks less and less successful, then we're winning.
I certainly hope that as we continue down this path of education, that the media, just like as a whole, starts using the right terms more often, or that we get some sort of like a unified definition, because that fear mongering
Yeah,
from the media, man,
and it can be intentional and it can be unintentional, but this is why
Right.
it's so important for databases to be very upfront and honest about how they're defining things, and then for the media to represent that when they're presenting numbers, say where it came from and how these numbers were defined.
Thank you for listening to the Fuse podcast. If you want to help us spark conversations just like this one, you can engage in our mission at fusecampaign.org. You can request more episodes or just get in touch with us through our website. This episode and all other episodes in our series can be downloaded wherever you find your podcasts.